Okay. Number 60, the Great Migration. In 1910, 7 million of the nation's 8 million African Americans resided in the pre-Civil War Cotton Kingdom. But over the next 15 years, more than a tenth of the country's black population would voluntarily move north. The Great Migration was the first step in the full nationalization of the African American population. Jacob Lawrence's The Migration of the Negro is a series of paintings created in 1941 about the shift of African American populations from a poor and repressive rural South to a prosperous but unwelcoming urban North. So what we want to do today is we want to take a look at the reasons for African Americans to leave the South, the factors that pushed them out of the South, the factors in the North that pulled them. Why would they go to the North? What was it that the North had to offer? And then the impact it had in both the South and the North, this huge demographic shift from the South to the North of African Americans. All right? So that's what our goal is today. A couple vocabulary words that'll come up in the paintings. The boll weevil, which is a small beetle that feeds on the fibers of the cotton boll, and it ruined much of America's cotton crop at times throughout history. And a strike breaker or a scab is a replacement worker who works during an ongoing strike. Okay, so what we're going to do is look at a series of paintings. They were all painted by Jacob Lawrence. They all have to do with the migration of African Americans northward during this Great Migration period. So we're going to use the paintings and the captions from the paintings to answer our questions today. Again, we're looking at what were the reasons they left the South, the push factors, what pushed them out, what were the reasons, what were the factors that pulled them northward, what did the North offer, and then the positive and negative effects of both the South and the North to this demographic change. So the title of the series is The Migration of the Negro. It's painted by Jacob Lawrence. And they are a series of paintings. We're not going to look at all of them, but we're going to look at a majority of them. The World War had caused a great shortage in northern industry, and also citizens of foreign countries were returning home. In every town, Negroes were leaving by the hundreds to go north and enter into northern industry. The Negroes were given free passage on the railroads, which was paid back by northern industry. It was an agreement that the people brought north on these railroads were to pay back their passage after they had received jobs. The Negro who had been part of the soil for many years was now going into and living a new life in urban centers. They did not always leave because they were promised work in the North. Many of them left because of southern conditions, one of them being great floods that ruined the crops, and therefore they were unable to make a living where they were. Another great ravager of the crops was the boll weevil. They were very poor. In many places, because of the war, food had doubled in price. Due to the South losing so much labor, the crops were left to dry and spoil. Among the social conditions that existed, which was partly the cause of the migration, was the injustice done to the Negroes in the courts. Another cause was lynching. It was found that where there had been a lynching, the people who were reluctant to leave at first left immediately after this. The migration was spurred on by the treatment of the tenant farmers by the planter. There had always been discrimination. Families arrived at the station very early in order to not miss their train north. Another of the social causes of the migrants leaving was that at times they did not feel safe, or it was not the best thing to be found on the streets late at night. They were arrested on the slightest provocation. And the migration spread. After a while, some communities were left almost bare. Many men stayed behind until they could bring their families north. The labor agent who had been sent south by Northern industry was a very familiar person in the Negro counties. The labor agent also recruited laborers to break strikes which were occurring in the North. After arriving north, the Negroes had better housing conditions. The railroad stations in the South were crowded with people leaving for the North. People who had not yet come north received letters from their relatives telling them of the better conditions that existed in the North. They left the South in large numbers, and they arrived in the North in large numbers. They arrived in great numbers into Chicago, the gateway of the West. The Negroes that had been brought north worked in large numbers in one of the principal industries, which was steel. Luggage crowded the railroad platforms. The migrants arrived in great number. The South, that was interested in keeping cheap labor, was making it very difficult for labor agents recruiting Southern labor for Northern firms. In many instances, they were put in jail and were forced to operate incognito. In a few sections of the South, the leaders of both groups met and attempted to make conditions better for the Negro so that he would remain in the South. They arrived in Pittsburgh, one of the great industrial centers of the North, in large numbers. As well as finding better housing conditions in the North, the migrants found very poor housing conditions in the North. They were forced into overcrowded and dilapidated tenement houses. They also found discrimination in the North, although it was much different from that which they had known in the South. Race riots were numerous all over the North because of the antagonism that was caused between the Negro and white workers. Many of these riots occurred because the Negro was used as a strikebreaker in many of the Northern industries. In many cities in the North where the Negroes had been overcrowded in their own living quarters, they attempted to spread out. This resulted in many of the race riots and the bombing of Negro homes. The Negroes who had been North for quite some time met their fellow men with disgust and aloofness. The Negro, being suddenly moved from out of doors and cramped into urban life, contracted a great deal of tuberculosis. Because of this, the death rate was very high. In the North, the Negro had better educational facilities. In the North, the Negro had freedom to vote. And the migrants kept coming. Okay, one last thing I just want to add to this is that the captions are actually Lawrence's own words, all right? So the painter himself provided captions for each one of the paintings. So that is a series of paintings by Jacob Lawrence, The Migration of the Negro, and now your task is to think about the causes and effects as we look at the paintings and read the captions. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a series of paintings. They're not all of the Jacob Lawrence series, but they're a majority of the paintings. So Lawrence was a painter of the Harlem Renaissance.